In the early 19th century, the United States was still a young republic, ambitious, hopeful, but far from powerful. Europe looked at America the way an empire looks at a noisy teenager. Interesting, but hardly threatening. And yet, in 1823, the United States declared something astonishing. The Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European meddling. No new colonies, no new invasions, no attempts to reclaim former lands. This bold statement would later be called the Monroe Doctrine, one of the most influential foreign policy declarations in world history. But here's the real puzzle. Why on earth did the great empires of Europe obey it? Why did nations like Britain, France, Spain, Prussia, and Austria, powers that ruled continents, listen to a country that couldn't even defend its own coastline? To understand it, we have to rewind the world a little. By the 1820s, Latin America was on fire. Colonies that had been under Spanish control for centuries were breaking free, one after another. Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. Everywhere, revolutions erupted against old European rule. For Spain, it was a disaster. A century of control was collapsing in a few short years. And the rest of Europe? They saw opportunity. The monarchies of Europe, fresh off defeating Napoleon, were determined to restore old dynasties wherever they could. A wave of take-back-the-colonies talk spread across Vienna, Paris, and Madrid. If those revolutions succeeded, it threatened Europe's worldview. If they failed, it promised new riches. Either way, Latin America was up for grabs, and the United States knew it. President James Monroe, guided by his brilliant Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, made a risky move. They warned Europe. Any attempt to regain territory in the Americas would be seen as a threat to U.S. security. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a small dog barking at a pack of wolves. Because honestly, the United States didn't have the military, the money, or the alliances to enforce a claim like that. Everyone knew America couldn't stop a European fleet. If Britain or France had decided to ignore Monroe, the U.S. could do little more than write angry letters. So, again, why did Europe listen? The answer was simple, and it had nothing to do with American strength. It was British power that made the Monroe Doctrine work. Britain had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars as the world's dominant empire. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. British merchants were flooding into newly independent Latin American markets, and the last thing London wanted was another country, especially France or Spain, swooping in and rebuilding colonial monopolies. A free Latin America meant open markets, and open markets meant profit. So Britain quietly told the United States, "We won't officially support your doctrine, but we'll enforce it for you." With the Royal Navy patrolling the Atlantic, European monarchies quickly understood something. Challenging the Monroe Doctrine meant going to war with Britain, not the United States. Suddenly, Monroe's bold announcement didn't sound like a threat from a weak young nation, but a warning backed by the strongest navy on Earth. Even with British muscle behind it, Europe did test the limits. Spain wanted its colonies back. France invaded Mexico in the 1830s, and again during the American Civil War. And during U.S. internal crises, European powers repeatedly pushed to expand their influence. And what did the United States do? Mostly, nothing. For decades, the Monroe Doctrine was more aspiration than reality. A promise the U.S. hoped to enforce one day, but couldn't. So why didn't Europe press harder? Because the cost of challenging Britain, and later, a rapidly industrializing United States, was simply too high. The doctrine survived, not because it was respected, but because it was inconvenient to violate. Everything changed after the American Civil War. The U.S. emerged with The world's largest army, explosive industrial growth, a massive population boom, and a fierce determination to dominate the hemisphere. This time, when the US told France to withdraw from Mexico, France obeyed, fast. By the 1890s, the United States had become a global power in its own right, and the Monroe Doctrine evolved from a bold statement to a strategic warning to a policy enforced with battleships. Europe no longer avoided the doctrine because of Britain. They now avoided it because of the United States itself. So why did Europe obey the Monroe Doctrine? Not because America was strong in 1823. Not because Monroe terrified anyone. Not because Europe respected US authority. They obeyed because Britain wanted new markets. War with the Royal Navy wasn't worth it. The US eventually became powerful enough to enforce its claim. What started as a fragile bluff became one of the most important pillars of American foreign policy, and a warning to the world that the Western Hemisphere was, at last, under new management. And that simple declaration, made by a young, insecure nation, would shape global politics for the next 200 years.